In 1969, the last truly wild horse on planet Earth vanished from nature. Not one was left roaming free, anywhere. For 16 years after that, this animal only existed behind fences in a handful of zoos, and scientists were terrified it would go extinct there too. Then, in the 1980s, Chinese officials did something that sounded like a bad joke. They loaded a small group of these zoo horses onto planes, flew them across the world, and let them go in one of the driest, harshest deserts on the planet. Top scientists said it would fail. Some gave the horses only a few months to live. What actually happened next changed how the whole world thinks about fixing broken land, and it started with a desert that was eating a country alive. A wasteland that was eating a country. To understand why anyone would drop fragile zoo animals into a killer desert, you first need to understand how bad things had gotten in northern China by the 1980s. The story starts in a place called the Yungar Basin, way out in the Xinjiang region of northwest China. Long ago, this land was covered in grass. Wild horses had lived there for thousands of years, and the whole landscape had grown up around them. Then, sometime around 1969, the horses disappeared completely. Hunting, habitat loss, and competition with farm animals had wiped them out. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It was just one animal gone from one region. But something strange started happening to the land itself. Without horses walking across it every day, the soil began to change. It packed down hard, almost like concrete. When rain fell, and it barely did, 4 to 6 inches a year at most, the water could not soak in anymore. It just slid across the hard surface and dried up within hours. Plant seeds could not push their roots down through the crust. Little by little, the ground was starving. By the 1980s, satellites showed the desert spreading outward by thousands of square kilometers every single year. Roads had to be moved, villages were swallowed, and the wind carried the region's topsoil hundreds of miles away, all the way to Beijing, China's capital city. Dust storms rolled into the capital so thick that skyscrapers disappeared from view. People wore masks just to walk outside. Hospitals in Beijing saw spikes in breathing problems every spring when the storms hit. To understand how bad a single dust storm can get, consider this. Meteorologists have recorded individual storms dumping more than 50,000 tons of desert dust onto Beijing in a single weekend. 50,000 tons falling out of the sky, coating cars, streets, and rooftops in a fine yellow film, all blown in from deserts hundreds of miles away. That is the kind of disaster northern China was living with every spring. China tried to fight back the only way anyone knew how. In 1978, the government launched a massive tree planting project, sometimes called the Green Great Wall, stretching thousands of miles across the country's northern edge. Millions and millions of trees went into the ground. On paper, it looked like the perfect fix. Trees hold soil in place, trees block wind. But there was a problem nobody saw coming. In some of the driest areas, those young trees needed far more water than the desert could spare. Their roots dug deep looking for moisture, and in doing so, they pulled groundwater down faster than the region could replace it. Wells that had supplied water to families for generations started running dry. Some tree plantations ended up making the water crisis worse instead of better. The numbers tell the story better than words can. In the years before 1976, China's deserts were spreading at a rate of about 1,500 square kilometers a year. By the late 1980s, that number had climbed to well over 2,000 square kilometers a year. That is an area roughly the size of a mid-sized city, swallowed up by sand every single year, and the rate was still climbing. The Yungar Basin itself, home to a massive stretch of shifting sand called the Gurban-Tungut Desert, was one of the biggest sources of the dust choking the capital. Out on the edge of the desert, ordinary families were the ones paying the price. Herders watched grazing land they had used for generations turn to bare sand within a few short years. Farmers watched crop yields drop as thin topsoil blew away, before seeds ever had a chance to take root. Entire communities were forced to pack up and move when the wells that had supplied their villages for decades simply stopped producing water. This was not some distant environmental worry playing out on a chart in a science lab. It was people's homes and livelihoods disappearing in real time. By the mid-1980s, China had poured enormous amounts of money and labor into fighting the desert, and the desert was still winning. Farmland kept shrinking. Dust kept falling on the capital. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. That is when a small group of Chinese scientists proposed an idea that sounded almost like a joke to the officials in the room. Forget more trees. Forget more bulldozers and irrigation pipes. Bring back an animal that had not set a hoof in this desert in over a decade, and let it try to rebuild the land on its own. To understand why anyone took that idea seriously, you have to meet the animal they were talking about. And trust me, this is not just any horse. If a story like this grabs your attention, you are going to want to stick around, because there is a genuinely wild plot twist coming, involving a horse that walked 30 kilometers in a straight line to water it had never seen before in its life. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the second half of this one, where the real payoff happens. The horse time forgot. Every horse you have ever seen in your life, every racehorse, every farm horse, every pony at a birthday party, shares something in common. They all have 64 chromosomes. Every single domestic horse on Earth does. The horse we are talking about today has 66. That 2-chromosome difference might not sound like much, but it tells scientists something incredible. This animal, called the Przewalski's horse, is not a wild version of a regular horse. It is a completely separate branch of the horse family that split off from our domestic horses roughly 40,000 years ago, long before humans ever tamed a single animal. While people were busy breeding horses to pull carts and carry riders, this species just kept living exactly the way it always had. Nobody ever broke one. Nobody ever put a saddle on one and made it stick. It looks like something that walked straight out of an Ice Age cave painting, and in a way, it did. Stocky body, short legs, a stiff mane that stands straight up instead of flopping to the side, and faint stripes running down its legs like a zebra's shadow. The horse gets its name from Nikolai Przewalski, a Russian explorer who first described the species for Western science back in the late 1800s, though of course local herders across Mongolia had known about these horses forever. In Mongolia, people call the animal taki, a word that roughly translates to spirit. That name fits, because in the wild, these horses live in tight, loyal family groups called harems, usually one lead stallion, a handful of mares, and their young, all moving together across huge stretches of open land in search of grass and water. For most of history, small herds of these horses roamed across the grasslands of Central Asia. Then, starting in the late 1800s, hunting and habitat loss began wiping them out fast. By the time anyone thought to really protect them, it was almost too late. The very last confirmed sighting of a wild Przewalski's horse came in 1969, somewhere in the desert along the border of China and Mongolia. After that sighting, nothing. The species was completely gone from the wild. Here is the part that should keep you up at night. At one point in the 20th century, every single Przewalski's horse left alive on the planet could be traced back to somewhere between 9 and 12 individual animals, most of them sitting in just 2 zoos, one in Germany and one in what is now the Czech Republic. 2 zoos. That was it. That was the entire future of the species, balanced on the backs of a dozen animals behind fences thousands of miles from where their ancestors once roamed free. The species actually got hit twice. The first crash came from hunting and habitat loss in the early 1900s. Then, right around World War II, the population crashed a second time, dropping to fewer than 20 animals capable of breeding at all. Losing that many individuals from such a small starting group creates something scientists call a genetic bottleneck. Basically, every horse alive today is closely related to every other horse alive today, because they all trace back to the same handful of survivors. That kind of narrow gene pool makes a species more vulnerable to disease and lowers fertility, which is exactly why zookeepers had to be so careful managing which horses bred with which, generation after generation, just to keep the species healthy enough to eventually go home. Slowly, carefully, zoo breeding programs around the world built that tiny population back up. By the 1980s, there were several hundred Przewalski's horses alive, spread across zoos in Europe and the United States. They were safe. They were fed every day. They had never once felt a desert wind or gone a single day without water in a bucket. And that was exactly the problem the Chinese scientists were trying to solve, because a species that only exists in cages is not really saved. It is just paused. One more strange detail about this horse is worth knowing before we move on. Even though it split off from domestic horses tens of thousands of years ago, a Przewalski's horse can still breed with a regular domestic horse and produce healthy offspring, animals with 65 chromosomes instead of 64 or 66. That almost never happens between two different wild species. It is one more clue that these horses are less like some ancient alien cousin and more like a long-lost twin, one that split off from the family tree and kept on living exactly the way it always had, while its domesticated relatives went on to pull plows and carry riders into battle. So in 1985, China approved a bold plan. Fly a small group of these zoo-born horses halfway around the world, let them slowly get used to a wild breeding center in Xinjiang, and eventually set them loose in the very desert their ancestors used to call home. The theory was that these horses were not just rare animals worth protecting. They believed the horses could actually help fix the broken land itself by digging up hardened soil with their hooves, scattering seeds through their droppings, and grazing the grass in a way that helped it grow back thicker instead of dying out. It sounded like science fiction. A group of pampered zoo animals riding on airplanes, landing in one of the harshest deserts on the planet, expected not just to survive, but to heal the land around them. Here is where it gets interesting, because what happened when those horses actually touched down in the Yungar Basin is the part almost nobody believed, even after they watched it happen with their own eyes. 11 horses step into a deadland. The first horses brought over from Western zoos landed in Xinjiang in the mid-1980s and were taken to a brand new facility called the Wild Horse Breeding Center near a town called Jimsar. This was not the wild yet. This was more like a halfway house, a place with fences and staff and supplemental food, where these zoo-raised animals could slowly relearn how to be horses instead of exhibits. It did not go smoothly at first. These were animals that had spent their whole lives eating from buckets and sleeping in heated barns. Now they were standing in a place where winter temperatures could crash to nearly 40 degrees below zero, and summer heat could climb past 100. Staff watched anxiously through the early years as the horses adjusted, worried that generations of zoo life might have erased whatever survival instincts their ancestors once had. But something remarkable started happening. Little by little, the horses began acting less like zoo animals and more like their wild ancestors. They learned to break through ice with their hooves to reach water underneath. They learned to paw through snow to find buried grass. Mares started forming tight circles around their foals during storms, using their own bodies as windbreaks. Nobody taught them to do this. Nobody could have taught them. The behavior seemed to be sitting there quietly in their instincts the whole time, just waiting for the right conditions to wake it back up. Year after year, the breeding center program grew. Foals were born. The population slowly climbed. Between the mid-1980s and the mid-2000s, that original handful of imported horses had produced close to 300 foals at the breeding center, a huge jump from just 24 founding animals. Slowly but surely, China was building a large enough, healthy enough population to actually risk letting some of them go. And by the year 2001, after more than 15 years of careful preparation, The scientists running the project were finally ready to try the real test. They released a group of horses, roughly 24 animals, into the nearby Kalamili Nature Reserve, a stretch of harsh desert and scrubland covering thousands of square kilometers. For the first time in over 30 years, wild Przewalski's horses were free to roam this land again. At first, the horses barely moved. For about a week, they stuck close to the release site, grazing nervously, drifting in small circles, almost as if they were waiting for someone to come put them back in their pen. You could almost imagine them glancing back toward the fence line every so often, half expecting a bucket of hay to show up like it always had before. Then, on the 8th day, something shifted. Researchers tracking the herd noticed one stallion suddenly break away from the group and start walking. Not wandering. Walking, in a straight, deliberate line, heading north with the rest of his small herd falling in step behind him. The tracking team kept watching the distance grow, 5 kilometers, 10, 15. By the time the stallion finally stopped, he had led his herd roughly 30 kilometers away, straight to a spring-fed pool of water tucked against a low ridge, a water source that was not marked on any of the project's maps. No living horse in that herd had ever visited that spot before. Nothing in his short life could explain how he knew it was there. Researchers could only guess that some instinct, buried deep and passed down from ancestors who had walked that same desert for thousands of years, had somehow survived captivity and come back online the moment it was needed. It is one thing to read about instinct in a textbook. It is another thing entirely to watch a horse born behind a fence walk with total confidence toward a spot on the map it had no earthly way of knowing. Over the following years, more horses were released in stages, and researchers tracked every single one with GPS collars to see exactly how far this new freedom was letting them roam. In 2004, the herd's territory covered about 120 square kilometers. By 2007, just 3 years later, that range had grown to roughly 660 square kilometers, more than 5 times bigger, as the horses pushed further and further out, searching for food and water on their own terms. Even with all that progress, the project stayed careful. Winters in the Yungar Basin are brutally long, and in the early years, staff still herded the horses into a protected corral for supplemental food and water once the deep cold set in, slowly weaning them off human help as each new generation grew tougher and more self-sufficient than the last. Foals born out in the wild started showing behaviors their zoo-raised parents never had, freezing instantly at the shadow of a hunting bird overhead, growing noticeably thicker, winter coats before the cold even set in, learning to tell different plants apart by smell alone. The scientists had gotten their answer. The instincts had not been erased by generations behind bars. They had only been sleeping. But surviving in the desert was only half of what this project was hoping for. The bigger question, the one that would decide whether this was just a nice animal rescue story or something far bigger, was whether these horses could actually change the land itself. To understand how a horse's hooves and droppings can heal a broken desert, we need to look at what was actually happening beneath their feet. Hooves that rebuild a desert. Here is something most people never think about. A horse walking across the ground is not just moving from one place to another. It is doing work. Remember that hardened, concrete-like soil crust that had formed across the Yungar Basin after the wild horses disappeared? Horses' hooves are shockingly good at breaking that kind of surface apart. Every single footstep punches a tiny crater into hardened ground, cracking the crust and creating a small dent where rainwater can actually pool and sink in, instead of sliding off and evaporating within hours. Multiply that by hundreds of horses taking thousands of steps every single day, and you start turning a sealed-off, waterproof desert floor into something that can slowly soak up moisture again. Grazing itself works differently than most people assume, too. It is easy to picture grazing animals as simply eating grass down to nothing, but that is not how wild grazers like these horses actually behave. Scientists tracking the released herds found that they do not sit in one spot and eat everything bare. Instead, they graze hard in one small area for a while, then move on, sometimes circling back to the same spot much later. This creates a patchwork across the land: tall grass in some patches, short grass in others, bare ground somewhere else. That patchwork turns out to matter enormously, because different insects, birds, and small animals each prefer a slightly different kind of habitat. A landscape with more variety supports more species, plain and simple. Then there is the part that sounds almost too strange to be true, but is very real. Horse manure works like a seed delivery service. As horses graze, they swallow seeds along with the grass. Many of those seeds survive the trip through a horse's digestive system, and the process can actually help break down the seed's tough outer coating, making it easier for the seed to sprout once it lands back on the ground, wrapped in a little pile of natural fertilizer. Horses roam long distances every day, so they end up carrying seeds from one part of the desert to another, connecting plant populations that had been cut off from each other for years. Put all three of these things together: hooves cracking open hardened soil, grazing patterns creating a mix of habitats, and droppings spreading seeds across the land, and you get something that looks a lot like a slow-motion repair job on a broken ecosystem. Grasses even have a strange trick that makes this whole system work even better. When a grazing animal bites off the top of a grass plant, the plant does not just sit there and sulk. In a lot of cases, it actually grows back thicker and faster than before, a response scientists call compensatory growth. It is almost like the plant is designed to expect a hungry animal to show up and take a bite every so often, and it uses that disturbance as a signal to put even more energy into regrowing. Left completely alone with no grazing at all, some grasslands actually grow slower and thinner over time. The horses were not just tolerated by the grass. In a strange way, the grass needed them. Within just a few years of the first releases, researchers documented plant species sprouting in areas of the reserve where nobody had seen them growing in nearly 2 decades. Their seeds had apparently been sitting dormant in the soil this whole time, waiting patiently for the right combination of cracked earth and moisture to finally wake them up. Insects that had vanished from the region started reappearing, drawn in by fresh vegetation and the steady supply of dung the horses left behind, which dung beetles in particular could not resist, burying it underground and enriching the soil even further in the process. Birds that fed on those insects followed. Small mammals followed the birds. Eventually, even predators like foxes started showing up on camera traps set up around the reserve. Each new arrival added another piece to a food web that had been broken for a generation, like watching a chain reaction rebuild itself one link at a time. Compare that to what happened with the massive tree planting efforts nearby. Trees need deep, steady sources of water to survive, and in some of the driest stretches of that project, the water simply was not there to give. Grasslands, on the other hand, need far less water to thrive, and they do not compete with the local water table the way thirsty tree roots can. In the areas where the horses were released, something scientists had been hoping for finally started to happen. The water table, which had been slowly dropping for years, began to level off. The horses were not just surviving in the desert anymore. They were quietly rewriting the rules of what that desert could support. If this sounds oddly familiar, that is because it is not actually a new idea. It is a very old one that humans just forgot for a while. Scientists have documented the exact same kind of pattern with other big grazing animals around the world. Herds of bison once shaped the grasslands of the American prairie the same way, breaking up soil, spreading seeds, creating patchy habitats that supported an enormous range of other species. Elephants do something similar across parts of Africa, knocking down trees and digging water holes that dozens of other animals depend on. For most of history, these big grazing animals were not just living in their ecosystems. They were quietly running them, like an invisible maintenance crew nobody thought to thank until they were gone. A comeback. Written in hoof prints. Decades later, the numbers tell a story almost nobody would have believed back when that first small group of horses stepped off a fenced holding pen and into the wild. The Kalamaile Nature Reserve, once a place where these horses had been completely wiped out, is now home to hundreds of wild Przewalski's horses. Just this past spring, wildlife officials released another batch of 30 rewilded horses into the reserve, bringing the total wild population living in Xinjiang to roughly 400 animals. Across the whole world, once counting fewer than a dozen surviving founder animals, the global Przewalski's horse population has climbed past 2,000, spread across zoos, breeding centers, and wild reserves on multiple continents. Think about that for a second. A species that once fit inside 2 zoo enclosures now has enough animals to fill entire nature reserves, all because a small group of scientists in the 1980s refused to accept that the story was already over. China was not the only country to try this. Mongolia launched its own reintroduction effort in the early 1990s, releasing horses into a place called Hustai National Park, where the population has grown steadily ever since. Similar projects have taken root in Kazakhstan, bringing horses back into wide-open grasslands where they had not roamed freely in generations. Each new project has leaned on the lessons learned from that very first gamble in the Yungar Basin. The idea that sometimes the best way to fix a broken landscape is not to bulldoze a solution into place, but to bring back the animal that spent thousands of years building that landscape in the first place. Scientists have not stopped looking for new ways to protect this species either. Back in 1980, keepers at a zoo in San Diego froze skin cell samples from a Przewalski's horse stallion, tucking them away in a facility nicknamed the Frozen Zoo, just in case they might be useful someday. Decades later, in 2020, researchers used those frozen cells to successfully clone that very same stallion, creating a healthy foal carrying genes from a horse that had been gone for over 20 years. It gave conservationists an entirely new tool for keeping the species genetically strong for generations to come, on top of everything the wild herds were already doing for themselves out in the desert. China's plans for the reserve keep growing too. Officials have already expanded the protected area and set goals to keep the wild population climbing over the coming years, with hopes that a larger, healthier herd will keep expanding the amount of desert land that slowly turns back into usable grassland. Step back and look at the whole story, and it is honestly kind of wild to think about. In the 1980s, this was one of the driest, most damaged patches of land in the entire country, expanding by the year, blowing dust onto a capital city 1,000 miles away. Every expert who looked at the plan to fix it with zoo animals expected failure. Instead, those horses cracked open hardened soil with their hooves, spread seeds through their droppings, grazed the land back into a patchwork of habitats, and slowly nudged an entire ecosystem back toward life. Nobody engineered that. Nature had already figured it out a long, long time ago. Humans just had to remember to get out of the way and let it happen. It makes you wonder what other broken landscapes around the world might have a similar fix hiding in plain sight, if we are willing to trust the animals that built them in the first place. The prairies of North America, the savannas of Africa, the grasslands of Mongolia, all of them were shaped over thousands of years by the animals that once roamed across them freely. In plenty of places, humans pushed those animals out and then spent decades and fortunes trying to replace what they used to do for free, with machines, chemicals, and imported trees that were never quite built for the job. The story of these horses is a reminder that nature often already solved these problems a very long time ago. We just have to be willing to admit we forgot the answer and go looking for the animal that remembers. If you liked digging into this one, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you catch the next deep dive when it drops. And before you go, drop a comment and let me know. If you could bring back one animal to help repair a damaged piece of land somewhere on Earth, which one would you pick?